This is a design that another chip carver brought to my attention and expressed some frustration having difficulty getting the results that they wanted on this, which makes sense to me. This is definitely a challenging design for a lot of chip carvers, I think, with the shape of these chips. Pretty much every one of them is going to be transitioning between with the grain and against the grain if you have a continuous chip or a continuous cut with the knife. And that's always a challenge to be aware of. And for the size that I've got this size to right now, it's would be the border on a 14-inch plate. So these chips are a little bit on the large side. If they were more straight chips or stayed in the same grain direction, they wouldn't be too much of a challenge. But the combination of how swirly they are and the size, knowing that they're going to be changing grain direction, is what makes this a challenge. And so this is going to be an exercise in paying attention to grain direction and using some different tools to figure out how to combat that. And one of my key things when I'm teaching chip carving is that there's some basic things, basic tenets and principles to keep in mind, but fundamentally what you need to do is try some different things and see what works for you. Not everything works the same for everyone. But I think one good place to start on these chips is to take out a relief chip out of the middle, and that's gonna kind of just open up the wood, make some room for the knife to be in there, and it should produce a little bit less fuss from the grain as we go. So this is a technique that I use a lot for large chips, and large is relative. Large for you might be different. Like I said, I probably wouldn't do this technique, the relief chips, if these were more straight cuts, but because of the curve, I think it warrants making these relief cuts. And one thing that you can kind of take them to the next level here as well, I just removed kind of this moderate size and left a fair bit of wood left uncut here. But what you can do is kind of come in and continue to remove more and more of that and get closer to your outside pattern line until just on the final one now there's not as much wood to be removed, and so that grain isn't going to put up as much of a fight as I transition. One other thing, primary consistent tool that you'll see me using here, or technique anyway, is to move the wood instead of the knife. On long curves like this that you want to be nice and smooth, and especially when you can be fighting grain direction, I find moving the wood instead of the knife is very helpful for that. And so for this one, again with the grain direction coming here, I'm going to fight this being against the grain most of the time, and it comes very close to along the grain and then comes back. So this section here would be a big challenge if I were to come from this way, which would be my normal cutting direction. So I'm going to flip the knife backwards here and come the other way. So now almost this entire chip is going to be a with the grain cut. And then I'll come back here and finish removing the kind of remnants there at the bottom that didn't want to come out. So on this I did end up having a little bit of grain that kind of ripped right here, right along that transition, right, this section is along the grain, and so then this is the first section that I start going against the grain, and that's the most kind of dangerous, fragile area, is when you're almost along the grain but just a little bit against it. Right there is going to be the biggest challenge. So there's different techniques that you can do. The first two that I said on this one is removing most of the wood and just leaving a tiny sliver to remove. Another one is moving the wood instead of the knife. And the other one that I think can be a little difficult to master is to actually carve two separate cuts, make two cuts instead of removing it just in one cut, to kind of do a half and half, a split cut on the same chip. So I'll show you what I mean on that. So right here is where it transitions between against and with the grain. So I'm going to start up here and go right to there. So that's a with the grain cut. And then if I continue, I'm going to run into that transition. So to try to avoid that, I'm going to switch to the other end of this chip. And now this cut is fully with the grain. And the goal is to make them meet up right there at that transition spot. And that making them meet is the part that makes this challenging. So you can see there's a little bit of a line there that they didn't quite line up perfectly, and I don't know that I'm ever really able to get that perfect on the first try, so you end up having to kind of play around a little bit with some cleaning up on that, and the more you're putting the knife in, the more you risk messing it up. So that's an option that I don't typically use unless I'm really having a lot of troubles otherwise. But it is something that I recommend trying on some practice boards and see if you can either make the technique work well for you, or even if it just works better than whatever else you're doing. It's the most you can ask for. But right here you can see as I move the knife along this edge and the wood's breaking, because I removed that relief chip at the beginning, it gives the wood some place to break into and to get out of the way. If I hadn't done that, if I didn't have this extra wood removed, then that would just be adding pressure against the knife. It would be resisting the cut that I'm trying to make, and might hinder getting good results. So that's why we remove that wood at the beginning. And these are, in effect, two-sided chips. They're kind of advanced, fancy two-sided chips. But you can see there's a point here and a point here, and just one continuous line all along. The rest of it's just solid curves, and curves don't produce edges, they don't produce corners. So kind of keeping that in mind, that you want to make sure this line is running right along the middle between the two edges. But I hope that those tips for this are helpful, and if you try this or something similar, that you can make use of those.